What makes one translation superior and makes others inferior, lesser, not getting as much out of God's word as they're supposed to, translating poorly? Why is this kind of a false question, at least in the space that we usually ask it? This is going to be an interesting episode, and I hope it really expands your idea of translation, linguistics, and helps you to look at Bible translations with a much more solid point of view, rather than simply repeating, well, essentially what comes down to propaganda for your particular translation. Let's get into things. Welcome to the TLDR Christianity podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that by going to the Give, Send, Go, or Patreon linked in the description. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can do that. I love talking with people. tldrchristianity@gmail.com, also linked in the description. If you're on a platform that allows comments, feel free to leave a comment. I love when there are comments because that allows other people to engage as well, even if most YouTube, Spotify, other places that allow comments are not always the best for that. I still like when we can start some sort of conversation. I like to hear your thoughts, even if you're someone who disagrees with me. Sometimes that leads to clarity. I like when we get to clarity. And that's something we're going to be talking about today. Clarity. I want us to have clarity. I want us to root our opinions in something that we understand, not simply repeating something we've been told. Now, I want to be clear. There are Bible translations that are better than others. But when we're talking about true translations, we're not talking about fringe things that call themselves translations, that are either a paraphrase or are simply doing their own thing, not actually translating, not using the word correctly. But when we're talking about things that linguistically are translations in English, they're all good. They're all good. They're all acceptable. We have just a plethora of wonderful translations of God's word in English. Now, are there ones that I would recommend way faster than I would others? Yes. Are there ones that I would say, generally, I wouldn't use this? Out of the good translations, the ones that are actually translating God's word, taking this truth and making sure it's accurately handled, out of the ones that are actually in the sphere of contention, there are ones that I would look at and say, yeah, hold up on that one. That one has some issues that are worth noting, but a lot of again, propaganda sounds like a little bit too strong of a word, but it really becomes that when certain translations repeat a certain phrase over and over again, and then people then repeat that over and over again without really knowing what that means. Because a lot of the terms that we use don't capture, linguistically speaking, don't capture what they actually seem to state. Things like literal. Well, what does literal mean? I mean, you can go find a bunch of translations that all say literal. The problem is nothing is literal in translation. That's the whole point. Translating, we have to take this thing and morph it into a new form, aka go from one language to another. How do we do that in a way that is truthful, accurate, and captures the words that God chose to use? English is not Greek. English is not Hebrew. English is not Aramaic. In fact, during the time frame of the Bible, while it's being written, those languages are changing and developing. And the specific form of the language you're using is going to impact things. You can look at modern examples like British English versus American English. Sometimes we use the same word, but understanding the context of that specific dialect is going to be important to know what that word actually means. Or look at Spanish. The variations between different Latin American countries and Spain itself can be pretty extreme, to the point where there can actually be communication struggles at points. So there's a lot to take into account. But we're going to have fun with this, and I hope this expands your view a little bit, helps you to think through this. But let's start here. What does Volkswagen mean? What does Volkswagen mean? Now, you might already know it means, in English, it means people's car. Volkswagen. But is that the literal translation? Well, yeah, I mean, that's what Hitler wanted it to be. Ooh, whoops. Oh, they don't like to talk about that part. They don't like how to talk about it was a Nazi socialist car. But yeah, that was the intent. This is a car for the common person. This is a car that everyone can get into. They wanted to get people into cars, and they made this people's car. So that's the literal translation of it, right? Well, here's the fun thing. English is a Germanic language, not a German language, a Germanic language. We stem from the same root as German. And if you slow down, you might notice that there are two words that make up Volkswagen. People's car, Volkswagen, so two words. And you can see them rather quickly, Volks and Wagen. Now, I'm not trying to pronounce them German at all. I'm pronouncing them in English. But you might be able to recognize what those words are in English. And yes, they are what they kind of look like. Volks, Volks, Folks, Folk, Folk, Folks. The Germanic word for people, Volks, Volk, is present in English, and it was our word used for a similar purpose, folk, until a different word derived from Latin and through French, people, came to dominate. Wagon. Yeah, that's just wagon. So the literal translation in English, just the word, because we have those same words in English, would be Volkswagen, right? Well, but that doesn't communicate the same idea. In English, that communicates, like, the thing I go to is like a rustic wagon out in the countryside. Because that's sort of how we use folky, things that are of a country nature, of a vintage, of a non elite nature. It's folk music, music of the countryside, music of the people. Folk wagon. Oh, it's a wagon that, country folk would use. No one's going to go, oh, that means, no one's going to look at that in English and go, oh, that means people's car. I mean, that means a car for the masses. Oh, that's, a Volkswagen. So which one's the literal translation? Do you literally translate the words to the nearest equivalent English word in the sense that it is the nearest etymologically, historically, what form of closest word are you talking about? Because in reality, the way that Germans would use Volkswagen, now we're not going to get into the different words that Germans have for car, and it's, now dominated by Otto, but back in the day, it was more up in the air, just like it was for us. Think horseless carriage. But a German person, when they say Volkswagen, to communicate that same thing in English, it would be people's car. And if you look at the definitions of the words involved, you'd get people's car. You have to go out of your way to choose Volkswagen. So which one's the literal translation? It comes down to what part are you trying to preserve? Are you trying to preserve the definition, or are you trying to preserve the closest fitting word in its origin? It's easy for German and English because, again, we come from the same root, so we have these words. And that happens more often than you'd think with the Bible as well, especially in the New Testament with the Greek, but even Hebrew, Aramaic, languages around that area crossed over with Indo-European languages quite a bit. Whether that's Greek influence through the different contact that the Greek world had with the Middle East and the Persian world, whether that's war or trade, or the Roman period, or Punic. What is Punic? Carthage. It's the language of Carthage. That comes from Phoenician, which is now Lebanon, just north of Israel, was in direct contact with Israel, and they spoke a sister language to Hebrew. In fact, in the Old Testament periods, especially the earlier portions of that, it's going to be a different dialect. So we get words coming in from there after Rome takes over Carthage, and also because of their massive trade influence. So you can pull a lot of words, but they're not going to necessarily make any sense because the meaning of the word has changed dramatically. Just a random thing I learned today. The suffix "stan," like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, is cognate, as in it shares an origin with the name in English Stan, and the word stand, and stone. You go back in time, and it's not even that far, and in English, those three merge together. You go back further, and eventually Stan, for, Afghanistan, land of the Afghans, merge. So if you're translating things, that could cause a lot of problems if you're not taking into account the fact that you're translating. Hey, I've got to make sure that I'm not just picking the closest sounding word, but I'm picking the closest definitionally to this. But then which one? You're going to come up with multiple words. Which one is the most literal? And which one is starting to morph the meaning one way or another? It's a much more complicated process than we make it out to be. And making it this binary, it's literal or it's dynamic equivalent, is a line that just does not exist. It's always going to be on this spectrum, but it's not going to be a simple line. It's going to be a 3D shape where you're pulling in multiple factors. Now, to emphasize this even more, let's quickly watch this short little video. Short little video that helps to get some of these ideas across.
According to Germans, this book has 150 sides. In English, for a rectangular prism, we just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And essentially, a book is the same shape, so where's this 150 coming from? As you may have guessed, it has to do with the number of pages. So now maybe you're thinking, okay, it has 150 pages, but that's not 150 sides. And you're right, for English. But in German, the word for a page of a book and the side of an object are the same word, Seite. So das Dreieck hat drei Seiten means the triangle has 3 sides. But das Buch hat drei Seiten means the book has 3 pages. This example teaches us one of the key lessons of language learning. Other languages don't map onto English one onto one. And I'm not even just talking about different grammar. There are many word pairs in English that map onto just one word in a different language, and there's many single words in English that map onto two or more. So just like English page and side only map onto one German word, Seite, German Zeit and Mal only map onto one English word, time. So like this one time I did something would be Mal, and then you ever think about time, man? That'd be Zeit. So when you learn a different language, you start to learn that some English words are polysemous. So time seems like just one concept in English, but actually in most languages I've studied, the two senses of time, either being as an instance or like time in general, are two different words. So like in Spanish you have tiempo and vez. And maybe that's how Germans feel with the word Seite, which often maps onto two different words in different languages.
Now, what's interesting there is the German word for side is where we get our word from side. So you can see they diverged, and if you're not careful about it, you're going to cause confusion. It's really important. It's fascinating. It's really interesting. It's, one of the most common places is pointed out is love. How Hebrew has multiple words for love, Greek has multiple words for love, and then English has love, which actually isn't true. We have multiple words too. It just happens to be that those different Greek words can all map onto love, this one English word, and same with the Hebrew words. But we have different words and concepts that communicate the same thing. But where do you choose one of those words or concepts in place of the word love? And at that point, are you starting to interpret more than you're simply translating? But granted, all translation is interpretation. You have to, again, translate it from one form to another, from one language to another. You are in that interpreting. Yet we would still draw a line between pure interpretation and translation. So it's interesting to me. Now, we're going to end on this. I know I said end, but that doesn't mean the episode's about to end. This is just the last part we're going to go over to communicate this. Is a pea a bean? Is a pea a bean? This is something I've heard multiple times. People say, oh no, see, a pea isn't a bean. A pea is a legume, and so are beans. Beans are legumes, but a pea isn't a bean. Now, I'm overemphasizing it. Usually people don't say in that many words, but I've heard multiple times say, oh, no, yeah, a pea's a legume, but not a bean. Is it? So, but here's the question. What's a pea and what's a bean? What do you mean when you say pea? Well, I'm guessing what you mean is, go get a green pea. Or it's different, a snow pea, snap pea, which are all the different stages of the same pea. It's all the common pea. Okay, so you can agree on that. You have this one plant, the common pea, and it's not a bean because a bean's something else. It's a different plant, right? There's the common pea, there's a common bean, and in fact, there is a common bean. And that's going to include a whole bunch of different beans, like pinto beans, black beans, navy beans. Those are all one bean plant. That's the common bean. Well, now we have a little bit of a problem because that common bean, which isn't the common pea, that common bean is from the New World. Yet, if you look at languages, they had beans in Europe. Okay, so what's a bean? Well, now we have to talk about historic meaning of it. You have your other beans, your other historic beans, like your garbanzo bean, your mung bean, your soybean, your fava bean. Those were all known and traded in Europe. And fun fact about fava bean, the word for it in Latin is faba, and that essentially just means bean. So the fava bean is the bean in English. So okay. We've got these historic beans, these beans that are all beans, and they're inarguably beans. They all are bean shaped. this bean shape, and they grow in the pod, and it's okay. They got the common bean and these other beans, but they're all truly beans. But wait, a garbanzo bean doesn't look like another bean, especially when it's dried out. It kind of looks like a lumpy pea. I guess that's why we call garbanzo beans chickpeas. Okay, now we got questions. Well, but then what's a pea? We still got the common pea. So even if bean is more expansive, we've got the common pea. Well, there are other peas, other peas that are directly related. The uh, the they're the lythanthrid. Like, man, I can't talk. Lythyrus. Group of plants, and they're again all directly related, grow similarly. Little red, or not red. Little. I looked at. There's one called a red pea, not to be confused with red peas, which are what the Jamaicans call kidney beans. Yeah, the Jamaicans call kidney beans red peas, but there is another pea called a red pea, and it's eaten other places, and it's kind of like what we'd think of a common pea. But there's also the sweet pea, the grass pea. There's also the Spanish vetchling, which is Greek, not Spanish, and called fava santorinis in Greek, or Santorini Island bean. So you got the Spanish vetchling, which is a pea in the same category as the common pea, but it's not Spanish, it's Greek, and in Greek, it's the Santorini bean from Santorini Island. Okay, so we've got some confusion here. And it seems like at different places, different times, bean and pea has been used interchangeably. Sometimes for the same plant. Garbanzo bean, chickpea. Okay. What is going on? Well, we got the legume family, which these are all legumes, and they all grow in pods. They've all got other similarities beyond that, but they're legumes. We've got that clear. And then so they're just different types of legumes. They're different whole categories. So we got all the beans over here, we got all the peas over here, and then we got some of those other ones are going to be like in their own categories or something else. Except legume isn't the name of the family. Legume is a common name. You know what its other common names are? The pea family and the bean family. Okay, so what's a bean at this point? What's a pea? Because now all beans are peas and all peas are beans, apparently. What? And it comes down largely to, what do you mean? Because for what you might have heard pea flour. That's one of the ways that peas, they're all peas because they have pea flowers. Pea comes from pisum in Latin, and technically that comes from Greek. And then bean comes from, the word bean comes from Germanic. So what we really got here is just, there's no fine difference between these two plants. It just happens to be that, particularly in English, not exclusively, but particularly in English, we pulled these two words that then got applied broadly. And then now we got to get a distinction, because at the core, we have a common version of each, common pea, common bean, which doesn't even necessarily match up historically to the use. And like, if I were to just say, I'm having peas tonight, you don't need to question which kind I'm having. You're going, oh yeah, you're having just, peas. If I say I'm having beans tonight, you're going to know roughly what I'm having, although you're probably going to be asking exactly what type. Technically, you do the same with peas, as there's other varieties of the common pea besides strictly just your regular green pea. But we have concepts that we think of for these, when in reality, that's not at all how it works. So in one sense, all peas are beans and all beans are peas. But in another sense, there is a bean and there is a pea. But then in another sense, well, if you might just be referring to bean as in pod fruit, pod seed. It depends on what do you mean by bean or pea. Which one are you referring to? What portion of it? The other fun fact is, if you don't know, some beans or peas grow in the ground and their pods are grown underground. Like a peanut. Yeah, peanut isn't just a legume. And this is the other one that people say, oh, a peanut is a legume, but it's not a bean. But yes, it is. It's just one that's growing underground. It's fascinating, but we want to limit it. We want to limit it and be like, no, this is a bean and this is a pea. But then you look at the history of the usage and you look at the different contexts, and suddenly it becomes much more complicated. What's the point of all of this? Again, like I said, this translational elitism is just bad. Everyone is in the same world going, okay, it just said bean. What is it talking about? What does it actually mean by this? Because that could become slightly important. When you're translating over, you might go bean. Okay, we have the English word bean, so it just means bean, right? Well, what are they talking about? Because fava santorinis in Greek refers to the Spanish vetchling, which is not very bean-like. At least if you're going by, bean-shaped. Which, though, just because it's bean-shaped doesn't necessarily mean it's all the same plant. It can be very different. And then again, you got things like garbanzo bean, chickpea. Where do you put that? What do you characterize that as? It becomes very muddied and complicated. And everyone is out there. Anyone that's correctly applying translation principles is out there asking the question of which English word. I have this pool of English words that this word bean could be applied to. Is it talking about a whole category? Is it talking about something that grows in a pod? Is it talking about a specific variety, a common bean, a pinto bean, soybean, which is not directly related to the common bean, just like garbanzo bean, mung bean, fava bean? None of those are directly related, as in they're not cultivars of the same plant. Everyone's out there wading into that pool going, I have to make a choice. Which one is accurately translating, accurately communicating the point and purpose of the word that was used in this other language? This translational elitism is generally really bad and gets us into a wrong thinking about God's word. We tend to minimize the divine guidance of the word, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second, in favor of elevating the human element of things. And what I mean by divine guidance is not a hyper King James only type of thing, but the fact that God is capable of preserving his word so that it can be accurately understood in different languages at different times in different places throughout history. Is also one of the reasons that the King James is not a super great translation nowadays, because English has changed significantly in the past 400 years. In fact, they were speaking a different form of English, even though it's still modern English. It was a different form of it back then. And in fact, English was not as unified as it is now. And depending on where you went, you get a radically different version that would be unintelligible. Potentially even a different language, a different English language, a different Anglic language, of which there still are multiple Anglic languages. It's interesting. To a large degree, there is not a translation. Again, we're talking true translations. There's not a more literal translation, a more word for word versus this one's thought for thought. That's generally a fake comparison. I understand why it's used by people, but it sets this wrong view in your mind of what's occurring in translation. If it's a translation, then it is both word for word and thought for thought. They're having to weigh both of those no matter what. They're having to take into account both of those if it's going to be a translation. And there's context of the sentence, which is going to radically change a word. There are so many factors. It's not this binary, and it's not simply an on-off this or that. But this isn't just about translations. It's about how we process information in general, how we understand the world around us, and how we communicate with others. When we communicate with someone, are we trying to take our thoughts, translate them into a form that the other person can understand? Are we trying to accurately communicate to that person, to break it down, to make sure it's understandable, to overcome any barriers in communication that you and the other person may have? Are you trying to accurately communicate? And when you start to think, hey, when I just said bean, I know what I meant by that, but there is a chance that they are using a different category for bean than I was. And neither of us are wrong because they're both valid in English. So you might need to clarify. Now, bean isn't the most amazing example for that because it does have a more generalized, understood usage. Again, there are points when it could mean something else and it's worth clarifying, but it's an example to show you that you need to be more conscientious about your words if you want to be communicating accurately to someone else. Are you letting your assumptions override facts? When you approach a new situation, are you filling in information with what you think fits? Or are you adequately putting things in their context so that you truly know what was meant by what you just took in? When someone says something, are you verifying what they mean or immediately jumping to conclusions? Because that last one is responsible for so many massive communication breakdowns across disagreements in our modern society. I've done it too, but I cannot tell you how many times I've looked at two people disagreeing about something and it starts to get more and more heated. And I just realize they're arguing for the same position. Or, I can see neither of them understand what the other person's saying. They're making assumptions. They're arguing against a straw man, a false version of the person's beliefs. Why? Because they heard certain words and they went, I know what that means, without putting them in their proper context, understanding what the other person meant, and verifying that what was just said aligns with your own interpretation. We are so bad at this in modern society. Are you reading the Bible for God's meaning, or are you jumping off to your own assumptions? Translations are a great thing, but they are only doing a small portion of the work of communicating God's message. They can remove certain barriers. Sometimes, in pursuit of being more, quote, literal, they put up barriers because they use poor words for English. They're not using the words that are actually in use in English, because that's important. Again, just because we have the word folk and wagon does not mean that that's necessarily the most accurate translation of Volkswagen. But when you go to read it, this is where the important thing is. I don't care what translation you have, whether you have an NIV, an ESV, a NASB, just not the 20. Don't get the 20. Whatever it is, King James. I'm not going to look at someone and go, oh my goodness, you're reading the King James? Wow, don't you know that English has changed so much in the past 400 years? You're not getting God's word anymore. Yes, you are. It's going to take you more work, but there's no barrier there. The real barrier is going to be with you. So if I ever saw someone, I wouldn't hand someone an NIV. That would not be my first choice, especially the most modern, or the newest version of it has some choices that are just truly bafflingly bad. I do not think those are communicating the actual words that were used. I think there is, they cross the line more than once when it comes to going into interpretation, maybe even further than that. But if someone's reading an NIV, I'm going to be like, okay, this is good. You are reading God's word. You're probably going to have more questions, but you're reading God's word. If someone, in particular, the earliest versions of the NIV were great for one thing. If you have poor English reading comprehension skills, you're going to be able to read it and get God's truth. Now, again, I'm not going to recommend it to someone. I would recommend a more robust translation. But I think a lot of the elitism around translations has actually hindered us when it comes to getting really, really good English translations. There are expectations out there now of what a translation should be. People clamoring, oh my goodness, is this a literal translation? Or is this a dynamic equivalent translation? What is it? But that's such a singular piece of a giant translation puzzle that's going on, and will lead you to confusion and lead you to a point where you think that an object has 150 sides when in reality it was a book and it had 150 pages. With all that said, I hope this is getting you thinking. This is the big point of this. I want you to be thinking more and asking better questions and engaging more with God's word. You have to do the heavy lifting. It's not the translations doing the heavy lifting. You have to do the heavy lifting. Now, we could talk about truly bad, quote, translations that are not translations, but that's not the point of this episode. This episode is to get you thinking more about engaging accurately with others and engaging accurately with God's word, because you're not boxing yourself in and thinking that the translation is doing all the work. You're not looking smugly at other translations in a way that you shouldn't. And you can better analyze, ask better questions about why a translation might be better than another. With all that said, I hope this has been useful. I hope it's getting you thinking. Let me know your thoughts. Again, you can contact me at tldrchristianity@gmail.com. You can leave a comment if you're on a platform that allows comments. And if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that by going to the Give, Send, Go or Patreon linked below. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the TLDR Christianity podcast. Remember, God has been so very good to us, so go bring glory to his name.